Larry Sanger, co-founder of Wikipedia, thank you for joining me. You've just had this quite epic moment, I would say, where you nailed 9 theses to the proverbial wall of Wikipedia. And I kind of posted on X that this is sort of a moment where Wikipedians' heads are going to be on a swivel because not just because it's you, though I think only you could have done this, but also because of the content, mainly because of the content, because you really hit the nail on the head 9 separate times, which is pretty remarkable. So I think I want to start out by asking the question of, well, first of all, maybe just give a very general overview of the 9 theses, and then
Mhm.
give us a sense of why you chose that title.
Right. I have been a critic of Wikipedia since 2004 or so, but I've never come out with a thoroughgoing plan for reform. And I've been talking to people, especially in the last 4 or 5 years. I wrote blog posts, three of them, about Wikipedia's bias on my blog. And they got a lot of play. And frankly, I have turned down dozens of interviews from some famous people, even just because I knew that they simply wanted me to badmouth Wikipedia more. It's like, and frankly, I didn't have a great desire to do that. But a friend of mine persuaded me, and I thought it through carefully myself, of course, that I have the sort of platform that would enable me to uh, develop a reform proposal. And that's interesting. What it means is that if I were to present the Wikipedia community a set of actionable items and they reject them, then what happens then, especially if they reject them publicly? I'd never thought about that before, and it actually makes a lot of sense. Uh, Basically, the Wikipedia community and the Wikimedia Foundation and Jimmy Wales, they have not been given the opportunity to say no to what I would call simply common sense. And that's essentially what I'm trying to do with these 9 theses. Now, most of them are ways to, no, not even most of them, 4 out of the 9 are ways to correct Wikipedia's problems uh, surrounding bias. But it's not all about that. There's also problems with its relationship to the public and just the way that it manages the community within. So,
So why the 9 theses? And you start out pretty clearly, giving reference to the metaphor that the 9 theses refers to, which is to Martin Luther nailing the 95 theses to the door of the. I actually don't know which church it was. I'm sure you do, but why did you choose to cast it in those terms?
because first of all, this is a reform proposal. I actually am Protestant myself. Um, have been reading a little bit of Luther lately, actually, and um, it's a good metaphor for the sort of reform that Wikipedia needs. I'm not saying that Jimmy Wales is the Pope, or
He might have
so.
said that.
Don't try to read too much into it. Um, but yes, that's the basic point. Um, I simply want Wikipedia to endure a period of careful examination within and without. Essentially, it's
Yes.
time.
Yes. So I'll just kind of scan through a few of them so people have a sense of what we're talking about here. So, number one is end decision making by quote unquote consensus. And um, in this particular case, those two quotation marks are very important because consensus is actually not not what's going on Wikipedia, even though that is the term that's being used. So let me just quote you from this essay, where you say, on Wikipedia, an article that is completely one-sided and quite controversial is often declared with furrowed-browed seriousness to represent the community quote unquote consensus. If this sounds ridiculous, that's because it is. The plain fact is that Wikipedian consensus is no consensus at all. Could you elaborate on that point? Because I think this cuts to the heart of the matter.
Right. There's a lot of things that I could say about this. I could give the historical background about consensus, where it came from. Uh, Perhaps not as necessary now as to say how it works. And uh, it is shocking to consider how it works now, especially compared to how it worked in the first, few years of the site, especially the first like 6 months. Back then, people would get together essentially, and there wasn't um, anyone who held sway over everyone else. I was the chief instigator, but I didn't assert my authority as an editor in chief, or at least not very often, very rarely. Um, for the most part, the goal was to negotiate with each other on what the article should read. If there were disagreements, people had fundamental disagreements even, then the only way to resolve the disagreement was to make sure that or more competing sides were fairly represented neutrally on the page. And everyone had to be equally satisfied or equally dissatisfied. And the result then would be called a consensus position, not because everyone agreed with everything that was in the article, but because everyone agreed that it was a fair representation of the whole landscape of discourse, so to speak. Okay. It doesn't work like that anymore. I don't know precisely when it changed. I suppose you could say that it changed gradually over the first perhaps 10 years, 5 to 10 years of the project. But it has the notion that there is one, as it were, party. I don't mean a political party, but one group of partisans on the platform that hold sway with regard to any particular article, and that their positions are blessed as the consensus position is just
Yes.
ridiculous and entirely contrary to the original idea of decision making by consensus. In fact, in the first year of the project, I myself had cooled on the idea. I guess I will say this, and then I'll shut up. The reason why we adopted this language of consensus in the first place is that the original wikis, um, Lord Cunningham's Wiki Web back in 1995, used a method of decision making that they called consensus building. So initially, there was just a discussion on a wiki page, and it was just like any other threaded discussion. And then someone else, when things seemed to cool down, would come back and they would do what's called refactoring the page. And so that it would beat the conversation into a narrative form that actually um, really read something like an encyclopedia article. And so this is how a lot of the original wikis worked. Um, so, and in doing so, again, it was an attempt to capture all the nuances of the represented positions that used to be in the conversation. So again, it doesn't work like that. Now,
Mhm.
Wikipedia Wikipedia simply represents as the consensus position whatever the most powerful people on the platform say is the case. And as far as I can tell, there isn't any more to it than that.
Right. Yeah, so that's something we've seen on, you can see that on controversial issues, social or cultural issues or political issues like um, gender and trans related, where there's going to be an overriding narrative that is almost preemptively deemed the consensus position. And they sort of refer back to consensus science or a consensus political position on a given issue. And COVID is a great example. There was a so called scientific consensus about the origin of the virus that turned out to be completely, at least unsubstantiated, if not outright false. But that was transferred over onto Wikipedia as the consensus, sort of like capital T, capital C, the consensus. And we also see that with these like hyper partisan or extremely motivated groups that work together. For example, the pro or the Hamas aligned or whatever, the anti-Israel, whatever you want to call it, pro-Palestinian gang of 40 that I've dubbed them, who can sort of corral and massage and manipulate and canvas enough that they become dominant in a topic area. So this like is all happens under the banner of consensus.
Mhm. Right, right. Yeah, so the consensus then is if it really represents a consensus of anything, it is the consensus of everyone who thinks in the approved way, which is a very narrow sort of consensus. Like a scientific consensus, the way that Wikipedians seem to think of scientific consensus is simply um, an average of the views that can be found in a very few journals and excludes the views of a lot of, you might call them dissenting scientists, as if they didn't even exist. So, yeah, it is very problematic, and it is the reverse of a consensus, in fact.
So this kind of leads into the second thesis, which is titled "Enable Competing Articles." And again, I'll just read a bit so people have a sense of what this is about. You write, neutrality is impossible to practice if editors refuse to compromise. And Wikipedia is now led by such uncompromising editors. As a result, a favored perspective has emerged, the narrow perspective of the Western ruling class, one that is globalist, academic, secular, and progressive. An acronym you have here as GASP. And this seems to be sort of the overarching perspective on Wikipedia. It's not uniformly the case, but I would say in the majority of instances, it is GASP that drives the conversation. It drives and shapes the debate. It's the sort of guidelines and guardrails to what happens on Wikipedia. First of all, it's a great coinage, GASP, which I believe is yours. But could you just
It is.
could you give us a little more insight into why this is such a problem that we have a GASP framework on Wikipedia?
It's a problem for the very simple reason that it's a very narrow subset of humanity in other countries, even other countries that have a lot of liberal representation, like, I don't know, France and Germany. There are approaches to the subject matter that are simply left out because they aren't found in, say, Western universities. And of course, it's much worse if you want to talk about the representation of viewpoints found in places quite foreign to an Anglo-American establishment um, viewpoint, such as, India or China or Africa. Um, there there are indeed professors at like Indian and Chinese universities who work in their own traditions. They have their own resources, and it's fascinating, frankly, to consider that those people might be employed referring to their own references, right, to sum up their points of view right alongside the typical atheist and Christian ones, essentially, that you'll find on Wikipedia. Now, I'm not saying that there is no representation of those other points of view on Wikipedia. There is. It's just that the resources that are cited are Western ones, so it's a Western perspective on foreign perspectives. And for that matter, it's not just a matter about nationality. It crosses a number of other sorts of ways of dividing up humanity, politics as well, of course. If and we will get to this in theses 3 and 4, but you know, it is hard to find, increasingly hard to find conservatives' perspectives, even stated critically on Wikipedia. Th You can find conservative figures bad-mouthed on Wikipedia, actually libeled, I think. Nevertheless, if you look for detailed characterizations of their positions and why they are held, that's actually gonna be hard to find on Wikipedia. So,
Yes.
I think that answers the question.
Yeah, it's and you kind of sum up this idea in that same passage where you say the problem is that genuine neutrality is impossible when one perspective enjoys such a monopoly on editorial legitimacy. And one of the founding principles of Wikipedia is neutral point of view, which if you have a single overarching point of view that wraps around the entire site, you by definition cannot be neutral. It's just one point of view is always going to win out. It's kind of what we see going on. So if we turn again, these kind of all, and I'm guessing you built this out intentionally. These all kind of one leads to the next, and this is very much the case with number 3, which is to abolish the source blacklists. And this is something that I think people don't really appreciate. I think most people have no idea that this is the case, that Wikipedia basically operates as a wrapper for the mainstream media because of a single list of reliable sources or perennial sources. Most of the green coded reliable sources are basically the cadre of mainstream media. What we know as the mainstream media, it's CNN, New York Times, CBS. You could pretty much pull one out at random. It's going to be green coded. Anything that diverges, it gets more iffy. Anything that veers into conservative media, you're going to see a lot of red or unreliable source coding. So the question here, and this was really shocking to me when I learned about how this actually happened, but how did the list come into being? Where does it derive its legitimacy from? And what effect does it have on the site on a whole?
So, in 2005, so several years after I left, somebody started codifying the policy on what they call reliable sources and started writing a number of different rules about what should be used in terms of like news sources and academic sources, whatnot, um, for what purposes. There was then developed a reliable sources notice board when people could essentially invite debate on the usability of a particular news source. And over a period of years, a certain kind of, you might call it consensus, or at least consensus of all who think alike, um, developed about a lot of the different sources. So then in 2018, a Mr. X, that's the name of the account on Wikipedia, decided to further codify uh, the existing understanding about the sources and made a color-coded list of lots of different news sources, and it just grew and grew, and people like debated what colors they should be. Green means can be generally cited in Wikipedia's own voice as a source of statements of fact. Yellow generally meant uh, could be cited maybe unless something better is available and has to be attributed. And then red meant basically should not be cited for anything except opinion, and even then it's very iffy. And in my experience on the site, generally speaking, if something like Fox News or the Washington Post is cited, then it's basically used only to badmouth the people who are writing in it or who are reported about. Uh,
Washington Times. You,
Washington Times is another example. There's a long list of those that are essentially blacklisted. And then there's another further category, which is gray, which has a special status in the site where you cannot even link to the site at all from within Wikipedia. There was such a site that I tried to put in the 9 Theses itself, and I had to make a link um, to my website to point people to the footnote where and a link to it's actually Op India, as it's
mm-hmm,
called. It's a
mm-hmm,
Hindu site.
yes. Yeah, so you have something like Op India, which is generally barred from being used as a source on Wikipedia. However, we see China Daily, which is, I believe, yellow, so sometimes reliable. And we also have Al Jazeera, which is effectively controlled by the Qatari government, which is green. It's generally reliable. And that's okay if you want to make that decision, but I don't understand how you can square these 3 different categorizations of Al Jazeera, which is controlled by an authoritarian regime in the Middle East, as generally reliable, China Daily, which is an official state owned and run propaganda organ of the Chinese Communist Party, which is sometimes reliable, and then a privately owned and run American conservative news site or news outlet that is never allowed to be used on the site at
Right,
all.
right. GLAD is greenlit, but as it
Yes.
happens, the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, is yellow, and I think it's red for uses in topics connected with the Israel-Palestinian conflict.
Yes.
There's
I think it might be green. I think it might be green and red.
okay,
I have to go back
yes,
and check. But yes, yeah, it's again the discrepancy pops up over and over and over, and this again where all of your 9 theses are interconnected, because this comes back to the generalized consensus on Wikipedia as to what is considered right think and wrong think. And I think Newsweek is a great example of this, because in Newsweek, they actually bifurcate it in time. So they say up until 2013, you're good to go. Newsweek, when it was sort of controlled and it was part of the mainstream media and it was part of the liberal media establishment, fine. Ownership changed in 2013. I think the new ownership has a tie to a Christian, or they're a pro-Christian group. At least it had been the case. I don't know if it's still the case. So from 2013 forward, it's no longer considered reliable. And this seems extremely arbitrary, that say, well, some of these outlets, we're just going to chop them up in time. We're going to now make this new determination that you can divide in time between reliability. And other cases, we're going to say on this topic, there's a carve out. So for the Daily Telegraph, it's green, you're good to go, except on trans issues, which the Wikipedia general consensus doesn't like their stance on trans issues. So just so happens on trans issues, it's not reliable.
right. Right. Well, I mean, it's very, very clear looking at that page that the Wikipedia editors have declared a favored point of view. It's definitely no longer a neutral point of view, is it? I mean, they take strong stands against Hindus and Christians, as it happens, and of course, ethnic Jews when they're defending Israel. Um, and yes, but now we're moving into number four, I suppose. Yes.
Yeah. So the it's a great point what you said because as another example, there's a project. Wikipedia runs these special projects, and there had been previously a BLM project, and now there is a project called Wiki Loves Ramadan, and it's all about creating more and more content about Ramadan, which is great. I think that's excellent. People should know about it. I'm curious and interested. But I really struggled, maybe I missed it, but I really struggled to find Wiki Loves Christmas. I couldn't find Wiki Loves Christmas. And there again, I'm thinking, why the imbalance? Why not, if you're going to say, okay, we're going to elect to have a Wiki Loves Ramadan project, why not have a Wiki Loves Christmas or Wiki Loves whatever other religious celebrations there may be? Why is there this one
Easter. Yeah.
that's
If you really want
Easter?
to,
Yeah, yes, exactly,
that'll really piss
exactly.
them off. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and to me, I'm not a Christian person, but I would actually like to know more about Easter, and I would like to see how it's celebrated around the world. I would appreciate that as much as I appreciated the same kind of content about Ramadan, but that doesn't exist. So, to your point about number four, which is to revive the original neutrality policy on Wikipedia, and I called out another little clip here from this, which is you write that the original and ordinary notion of neutrality is simply that when an article mentions a topic of controversy, it should be impossible to tell what position the authors take on the controversy, which is something that I was actually speaking about today. This concept of Peter Boghossian has this idea of street epistemologies. If you're having a debate, you ideally should not know what the debater's personal views are on the given topic. You should be able to just argue it clearly in a very straightforward manner without your bias being visible. And I think that's along the lines of what you're calling for here. But why don't you give us a little bit better of a sense?
Interesting that you should say that because I had a controversy with Boghossian before he was famous in, I think, about 2012 or so. I took him to task because he has changed his opinion, his approach on precisely this. Now, when I
Hmm.
taught philosophy of religion as an agnostic at the time, I'm no longer agnostic. I was converted in 2020. Um, Nevertheless, back then, I taught the traditional arguments for the existence of God and problems about God, such as the problem of evil and so forth. Um, and I taught them in such a way that my students wouldn't be able to tell whether I was a theist or an atheist or an agnostic. And uh, just to illustrate the concept a little further, I asked the students at the end of the class one time, "What? How many of you think that I believe that God exists?" And about a third of the hands went up. And how many of you think that I believe God does not exist? And another third of the hands went up. And then how many of you think I am an agnostic? And another third of the hands went up. And I said, I've done my job. Um, so
Excellent.
uh,
Yeah.
back in 2010, 2012, Boghossian was taking a different line. He actually wrote a book about this and said that it was actually the obligation of philosophy professors to persuade their students of the irrationality of Christianity.
Hmm.
um,
Wow.
well, and I've said that is not eh, the way that most atheist philosophers approach the subject. Philosophy is supposed to be about, allowing the people to make up their own damn minds for themselves and to do so in a way that is supremely rational. So, this is a good way to understand the concept of neutrality. Neutrality is very important because it supports us all in the uh, quest to to arrive at the truth. Uh, and here I don't mean a truth according to a person, a relativistic truth.
Yes.
What we really think is the objective truth, right? But we need to be able to arrive at that position ourselves. And unless we have access to all of the relevant data that impinges on the question, unless we view the different positions um, with the sort of sympathy that the people holding those positions would expect, we will not really understand the positions. And we will not have all the tools we need to make up our minds for ourselves. That was the reasoning behind the neutrality policy, as far as I'm concerned. There's another bit of reasoning behind the neutrality policy, but that also explains why it's actually really important. I would say that neutrality in society is as important as free speech.
Mm.
In a certain way, free speech basically supports us in our ability to, well, say what we want to especially to powerful people. But neutrality allows us the liberty to learn the full breadth of information that we need to freely and rationally decide on what the truth is for ourselves.
But this also sort of presupposes the idea that there is such a thing as objective truth, which
Right?
the Western tradition is built on this idea. It's the core of the Enlightenment, and it somehow has slipped away.
It's the core of a biblical approach to the truth as well, I might
That's right.
point out.
That's right. Yes, that's right. And that's why the all the different traditions, the biblical traditions, they study each other because they understand that there is something to learn from the tradition, even if you have very different interpretations of it. But what I fear is that what we've seen since uh, maybe the at the latest the 1960s, it probably goes back much earlier than that, is a inversion of this idea. And what we have is a notion of truth that is constructed. And when you inject the Marxist element into this, it's that truth is a result of power, of power dynamics being exerted. And this is something that I see on Wikipedia,
Yes.
because what we have here, and this is, again, goes back to the very first of your theses, number one, consensus. Consensus is being constructed, it's being forced, it's being used as a tool to advance somebody's ideological agenda in almost every case that matters. And that I think is very scary phenomenon that we're seeing on Wikipedia today, which is a abandonment of truth and a very strong embrace of the idea that this is all just essentially ideological marketing.
Right? No, I couldn't agree more.
So let's go skip down to who actually runs Wikipedia. I'm not talking about the Wikimedia Foundation. We'll come back to that, but I'm talking about the number 6 here, which is reveal who Wikipedia's leaders are. And again, you really need to know a lot about Wikipedia to know that this is even the case factually. Most people, and I would say 99% of people who use Wikipedia and who inadvertently or directly rely on it have no idea that this is the case. But there are certain elite users or power users, and there's different kinds of them, and they exert a huge influence on not just the website, which would be one thing, but on information today. So could you just expand who these people are, what their categories are, and what effect they have on information?
Sure. So, a lot of people, who don't know anything about Wikipedia, just sort of assume that it is a for-profit edited encyclopedia. Of course, it's written by volunteers, and like any online volunteer website, it's possible to be anonymous. Now, you might think that as people get more authority, editorial authority in the Wikipedia bureaucracy, which is kind of funny to say because in the early days, there was nothing like a bureaucracy. Now there really is. Um, so it's the idea that you don't have to reveal your identity continues on regardless of how much authority you have in the system. You can be at the top of the hierarchy and you don't have to reveal your identity. There is no pressure. And if anything, there's a little pressure to withhold your identity. Um, so I identified 3 different groups that I thought, at least according to their role in the system, wield the most authority. So there is the arbitration committee, which has, I think it's 15 members. I think that's right.
I believe so.
Then there is the bureaucrats, who I believe there's 15 of those. The bureaucrats are people who can essentially dub the cops of Wikipedia, the administrators. All right, so they are the super administrators who make administrators out of ordinary accounts. And then there's the check users. A check user is uh, basically an account that has the ability to check the user's IP address. And this is important because if you really want to prevent people from abusing the site, then you have to stop what are called sock puppets. In order to identify sock puppets, you need to have access to IP addresses. So the idea is an IP address is just the address of a computer on the internet. And if somebody makes 2 different accounts and they both come from the same IP address, then it will look like it is one person running 2 accounts. That would be a sock puppet. That's a big no-no on Wikipedia unless they're specially announced for particular purposes. Uh, Users are very powerful, and I think that I forget the number of those. Altogether, anyway, all 3, there are 62 of such accounts. And out of all of those, only 9 of them reveal their real names. So 85% of these most powerful accounts, the Power 62, as I call them, 85% are anonymous. I mean, that's crazy. How is that possible?
Yeah, that's and these again, I think for people to understand, if this all was all just kind of um was all kept within the confines of Wikipedia, and this was just some kind of like Tumblr or fan website or something, fine. That's great. But this is the information that is piped into ChatGPT, into Gemini, it's used as training data, as reference data for every frontier AI model. It's used on Siri and Alexa, and not to mention Google. If you have a topic search, you type in something like free speech, which I've done, and you really look closely at the results of that first page, you will see that the majority of the page has been constituted by Wikipedia information. And most people just have no idea this is going on. And when you have the Power 62, as you've called them, controlling at a very top level how this information gets produced, who gets to say what, who are the admins that can police it, and you don't know who any of them are, save for 15% of them, you got a problem. Because most of them, or maybe a plurality, are, I'm sure, great people, and they're doing their best, and they're working really hard, and they're volunteers. However, that doesn't mean that a significant minority are not bad faith actors. They
Mhm.
could be anybody. This is the whole point. We don't know. And that lacuna, that absence of knowledge, is what's really scary.
That's right. Um, the problem is, and it isn't just the Power 62, frankly. There are some accounts that are very influential that don't have any special authorities. They just have a lot of edits and a lot of
Yes.
friends.
Yes.
And who knows what's going on behind the scenes. Um, but what this means, the practical consequence for, unfortunately, a lot of people that I've talked to over the years is that it's possible for people to be libeled on Wikipedia, and the victims of the libel have no legal recourse. They really can't do anything about the problem. They can go and complain on Wikipedia, but if the Wikipedians basically don't want to listen, they don't have to. And if you continue to complain, you'll be blocked.
And
So
this is not abstract, because you actually have an example in one of the essays about someone who was libeled. This was one of the more famous cases. Could you elaborate on who that person was in in the early
sure.
days?
So John Siegenthaler Sr., this is like the first like famous person that contacted me to complain, at least the first one that I remember. In 2005, um, he called me up one day out of the blue. Don't know how he got my number. Um, and, he said, I'm the former publisher and editor in chief of the Tennessean newspaper, the biggest newspaper in Tennessee, and one of the founding board members of USA Today, John Siegenthaler Sr. And the Wikipedia article about him was accusing him of having been, well, at least under suspicion of having something to do with the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. And, Siegenthaler was deeply offended because he had actually worked on Kennedy's campaign and, was a friend, actually, an ally. And the person who wrote this admitted and actually apologized to Siegenthaler, which is good, before he died. So Siegenthaler died, I think, I don't know, 2018, something like that. Uh, and I said that it was just a joke. He didn't mean it even to like badmouth Siegenthaler as just a joke about Wikipedia, but it obviously had real world consequences. Now, in that case, Wikipedia still had enough sense and decent people involved that it was quickly resolved. And I'm not even sure that that sort of case would happen now, but there are many other sorts of cases that continue to go on. People tell me I can cite mainstream sources for my that explain my position on some topic. Robbie Starbuck is one of these people who contacted me recently. And he essentially has no recourse. He couldn't sue them if he wouldn't be able to identify the anonymous people who wrote about him, and he wouldn't be able to identify, you know, any sort of managing um, administrator or Power 62 member that might have gotten involved in his case. So, he's between a rock and a hard place. The only sort of successful lawsuits that have been brought against Wikipedia for defamation have happened in countries other than the United States, because the United States extends to the Wikimedia Foundation, which owns the platform, the Wikipedia platform, and immunity,
Yes.
protection from lawsuits, because they are a general platform that invites the public to contribute.
Right.
Uh, the problem with this is, of course, that they set up the platform in a way so that it can become a veritable engine of defamation. So,
Right. Right. And you're talking about Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act, which basically grants immunity from any kind of liability to digital platforms, internet platforms that host content, and the protections are extremely broad and very robust. And what that means is that when you have anonymous users, let's say there were a different case where this might happen on Facebook, and the person who's making an accusation is a identified individual, you could potentially, it's still difficult, but you could potentially hold that person accountable. With anonymous users or anonymous editors in this case making these claims, there is no accountability whatsoever. And I think for lots of people who I've spoken to who feel they have been defamed, and many of these people have actually been defamed, the most frustrating point of it is that there is no recourse. There's no address for them to deal with this. Maybe technically there is, but it doesn't actually work, as you just pointed out. And they just have this piece of information out there permanently that is getting piped into every chat AI, into Google, into Alexa and Siri, and it often is just not the case. And again, back to the anonymity question in this context, this could be a competitor, it could be a disgruntled employee or an ex, or someone who just has it out for this person and is actively using the platform to settle the score, which is, of course, not what it's meant for. But again, there's no protection against this. And again, we come back into one of your solutions here, which is not another one of the theses per se, but you've got a very interesting proposed solution, which is that, I'm quoting here, Congress could create a narrow statutory carve-out that addresses Wikipedia's unique situation. The law might be amended in the following way. If an organization generates in excess of $100 million in revenue, that's the case for Wikipedia, which brings in much more than that annually. And B, the platform hosts anonymously sourced content. That is also the case with Wikipedia. And C, such content is presented as factual and neutral. And D, the platform refuses to identify key content decision makers, then the organization should not be entitled to Section 230 immunity. You're giving this as an example. You're not a legislator, but this is a kind of carve out that could help deal with this very real issue.
Right. Well, that's a fallback position. As philosophically libertarian or conservatarian, at least, um, I don't like depending on the government for solutions, even against Wikipedia. Um, my first preference would be that Wikipedia essentially out well make a requirement. Here, let me start over. In fact, let me get my notes here just a second. Okay, these are the notes that I used with Tucker. Yes. Okay. Um. So, all right. So from the top, then,
Sure. Go ahead.
the solution that I would actually like to see tried first, that is, if they were at all willing, which unfortunately I think they're not, would go something like this. First, they would be required to, rather, top level editors would be required to use their real names. All right. Um, the Wikimedia Foundation would offer them assistance against any sorts of personal threats. Um, there would be definitely some liability insurance purchased for them. The Wikimedia Foundation is making a lot of money, and the number of people that might be required to be named in this way might be relatively small. I think they would be able to afford monetary compensation. Just a stipend wouldn't necessarily be enough to live on, but something um, to motivate people to stay on board after this change. And there are some other things that also need to change on Wikipedia. Right now, it's actually rather difficult to become an administrator. And there's reasons to think it should be difficult, but not as difficult as it is. the number of administrators has actually dropped from something like
Hmm.
1,200, I think about 10 years ago, to I think it just dropped below 800, the number of administrators. Um, and then finally, actually, and this is also really important, I think the subjects of articles should be given a prominent page of their own on which they can write a response to Wikipedia articles. If they do nothing else, that would help. So the
Hmm.
idea is if somebody finds himself being libeled by Wikipedia and they have no other recourse, at least they can give the person a link at the top of the page to another page that they control, in which they say, well, I think Wikipedia got it wrong on these points, and here's some more information with my own sources, etc. That would be fair. And it would also be appropriate. I mean, it would be extremely appropriate considering that Wikipedia is edited by volunteers, after all, who, for all we know, might be working for the CIA. They're anonymous, after all, or PR companies who are in the pay of Fortune 500 corporations, and who knows, so there might be actual um, bottom lines and multi-billion-dollar decisions being made on the information that is on Wikipedia, and yet we don't know the people who are responsible for making these decisions. It's very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think at this point, we've seen the extent of so-called pay to play on Wikipedia, where paid editing happens all the time in many different formats. And the ones that have been disclosed include big pharma, as you say, Fortune 500. The Department of Defense, senior official has done paid editing. Uh, there are, by my count, no fewer, and I think this is very conservative, no fewer than 200 agencies who all they do is paid editing on Wikipedia. And there are probably thousands of articles that have been edited by paid editors on behalf of brands, big companies, small companies too, and as well as government and who knows what else. So this again, the problems, and I think this is a general issue with Wikipedia. The problems are so deeply buried beneath the surface of the site that it is very difficult, probably impossible, for 99.9% of Wikipedia users, consumers of the information, to even know that they're there. This being just one of them. So at least having accountability and true transparency. Transparency is such an important part of the Wikipedia ethos, but it is not there. I think I can make that statement confidently. There is not
Absolutely.
actual transparency.
Yeah, this is actually really important. It's something that I didn't talk about that much in the nine theses, and I could have mentioned it, but there's plenty of evidence that a lot of the negotiation that goes on is not visible on the talk pages. That there are just people that show up suddenly, and there's like a whole crowd that descends on a page and declares support for one position, and the debate is over. And this seems to be what is called in Wikipedia land canvassing. Um, and as long as you keep it quiet, you're essentially allowed to do it. I mean, you're not officially allowed to do it, but you can, right?
There's
So
no way to stop it. There's no way to even know what's going on. If someone, three, four editors, that's all it takes. Three or four editors working in coordination on an email chain together somewhere, on a Discord together, on a WhatsApp, it doesn't matter, that are coordinating their viewpoint. And again, this goes back to all the different issues we've discussed, is starting from the very first, which is about the false consensus. And the consensus that appears is the consensus of it could be as few as three editors on a topic or an article that have coordinated to just basically outlast any opposition to their viewpoint. You
Uh-huh.
just need to exhaust them, which is not that hard to do. These, everyone is living a busy life, and how many hours are you going to put into this one point on an article? And on the other side, these people might be very committed to the issue because, well, we don't know why. This is again back to the question of anonymity.
Right, right. Well, which actually goes back to the first essay. Right now, they pretend to make decisions about such difficult issues by consensus. And what that means is that there can be this interminable back and forth between people, and we can't reach a consensus. So we just keep making arguments until one side essentially gives up, or somebody steps in and is able to say, no, no, you're a naughty boy. You broke the rules of behavior, so you're out of here. You can't work on this article anymore. And by the way, one side now holds the day on the editorial question. So no, there clearly needs to be a new way of arriving at fair, um, sound editorial decisions on disputed questions. That's very important.
So one question that I still have for you is, and it kind of touches on everything here, is what is Wikimedia Foundation actually doing? We know what they're not doing, which is addressing any of the things we've talked about. But this is a extremely rich foundation. It's raising a lot of money. I think that you cite a number in one of the essays of $185 million of annual revenue, which sounds about right. In addition to a endowment that's well over $100 million at this point, and that's also in addition to just assets and other money that they have in the foundation circulating in other ways. So we're talking about something that's on the way to becoming $1 billion foundation if it's not really there already. What are they doing with all that money? And why are they not addressing what I've begun to call the Wikipedia crisis?
So that's a very good question. You can look at what they have on the books. They have to file an annual report as a major uh, nonprofit. Everything is nicely laid out, but the categories are a little vague. So they do pay very significant salaries to quite a few people at their central office, um, and then they disperse a lot of grants, um, and some of the grants seem to go to people who are editing Wikipedia for particular purposes, for public-minded purposes, I suppose you might say.
Like the BLM project that I mentioned earlier,
I
as an
suppose,
example.
right? Any number of things. A lot of those tend to be woke sorts of projects for sure. Um, And then there's some other kinds of grants that we're not really sure what the people are doing with the money, and it might simply be a way to transfer money from one group of wealthy people to another group of people who are ostensibly doing some sort of charitable work. Um,
Meaning those are outside NGOs. Those are not, no, this
yes,
is money that's going from Wikipedia donors through Wikipedia to a separate nonprofit.
that's right. Um, so they have become if you donate to Wikipedia, then some portion of your money is simply going to another nonprofit, or other nonprofits. A little bit like the Tides Foundation, I suppose. Um, so
Which Wikipedia partnered with. Wikimedia.
that's right. So let's see. But beyond that, they aren't actually managing what's going on Wikipedia, except from a legal standpoint, right? So they are the legal owners of the platform, which does impose some requirements on them. So, if somebody really is provably libeled, um, sometimes the Wikimedia Foundation will step in and take some action. Uh, can't really say how often that happens now, but I know that it does happen. But for the most part, a lot of that stuff just is let alone. Um, and
So
yes,
why do you think they've just, when with the importance of this issue, which they know how important Wikipedia is in the information ecosystem. They talk about it all the time. And with the amount of pressure that they're seeing, now we have a congressional investigation, the oversight committees now investigating foreign influence on Wikipedia, and people like you and people like myself as a journalist looking into this, and lots of other people. It's not just me or you and a few other. We're talking about dozens and dozens of people, a lot of veteran editors, people who love the site or once loved it. With all this happening, why would they not? I mean, you will have to speculate, but I'll ask you to speculate. Why would they not take more significant action?
first of all, I hope they will finally take significant action now. After the 9 Theses, after an interview with Tucker, you, Lex Friedman soon. I really do hope that they will be imposed upon to address the problems that we're talking about here. Um, if the Wikimedia Foundation, no, let's reverse this. If the rank and file Wikipedian editors don't do anything about the problems in the 9 Theses, then I actually think it is incumbent upon the supposed adults in the room, the Wikimedia Foundation, to step in. And frankly, I think they really ought to start with the last of the 9 Theses and convene what would essentially be a legislative assembly, right? That takes editorial responsibility for what's going on Wikipedia. There is no one in charge, editorially speaking, on Wikipedia. Now, you might say, well, that's because it's a wiki and it's supposed to be a flat organization, but it clearly is not, right? And for all of the reasons that we've been rehearsing here, it's not likely ever again to be a flat organization as it was very briefly in its early days. So I think they need to adopt the rules. This is actually a thing that I would like the Wikimedia Foundation to do, like in the next month. Um, they should adopt rules for a constitutional convention. Basically, um, the primary goal of the convention would be to set up an editorial assembly. Both bodies then would conduct business face to face. So there would be one person, one vote. Votes for members, representatives to the Constitutional Convention and the Assembly should be confirmed one person, one vote, which has special technical requirements. And then the first order of business would be to rewrite the existing rules, which really are a morass, simply making them more simple and coherent. Now, that is a thing that the Wikimedia Foundation can set in motion and really should set in motion. Now, I can tell you why they don't. It is they sort of fancy themselves in the same sort of relation to the wiki and what's going on the wiki that the publishers of a journalistic organization take to the newsroom, right? So there's supposed to be a very clear line between the owners and the actual editors, and they're not, the publisher is not supposed to issue orders to the editors, and that's
Right.
that's nice, but the
Right.
problem is um, the publishers ultimately set the rules about how the newsroom is run. And I think it's long past due a reform. I don't know if the current group of people at the Wikimedia Foundation are the people to do such a reform, but I think they will probably be pressed one way or another by the public, by competition from Grokpedia, um, or from Congress, frankly. If Congress basically acts in various ways, which they can do to make it harder for the Wikimedia Foundation to assert Section 230 immunity, they can do that, right? They can't simply declare that they are a publishing organization. That's not how the law works. But they could make a carve out, right? Which basically then essentially does remove their immunity. If that with that hanging over their head, my hope is that they will take action.
I hope you're right. Wikimedia Foundation is now, as you well know, in the search process for a new CEO. The previous one has announced her resignation, so we will see who steps into the
When
role.
was that, may I ask?
That was a few months ago that this was announced, and the search is underway. And we have again, back to the question of transparency. We don't know who the candidates are. We don't know. This will not be done by a community decision. This will be something that's done behind the scenes and according to processes that no one has access to. But that being said, hopefully whoever it is and whoever steps into this role will be listening, as WMF people like to say, but they will also be acting, because we are, I think, at a point where as you've made clear in the ninth thesis, there is, I think, where Wikipedia is approaching a point of no return, by which if they continue to ignore or to fail to act on some of these or any of these issues, things will get so bad that they will lose trust, which is the worst thing that can happen to Wikipedia. Is they'll lose the trust of the public, the way the mainstream media lost the trust of the public, and they will also start to incur more attention by lawmakers and people whose job is to oversee processes are run correctly, especially when we're dealing with a U.S. government established tax exempt nonprofit organization. They do not pay tax to the American government on the thesis that what they're doing is for the common good or is for the good of someone. So all these factors, I think, will militate towards hopefully someone taking action, but that will remain to be seen. Very last question, which is, you actually have a reference here to the elephant in the room, but there's another elephant in the room, which is the role that Jimmy Wales is playing in this dynamic. Do you think he's playing any role? Because as we talk about this, I noticed, and it kind of just occurred to me, that we haven't brought his name up, even though it does come up often. But do you think there's any place for Jimmy's voice? Do you think he's having or had a net positive, net negative? How do you see that?
I don't know what role he in fact plays. I think he has a permanent board seat on the board of trustees. Pretty sure that's true. I'm not really sure what he does for the Wikimedia Foundation these days. What I can say is that he certainly has a voice. As the other founder of Wikipedia, he has a massive pulpit. If he were to get behind any of these theses, that would make it much more likely that they would that whatever thesis he got behind would be. Uh, sorry, let me start over. If Jimmy Wales were to get behind any of the theses, then that would make it much more likely that it would be implemented. So,
We'll have to see, I guess, how or if he responds.
right?
Hopefully he does. Hopefully he's read all of this.
Hopefully.
If he's listening, I would really strongly advise him to do so. I think he'll understand exactly what the issues are. He's probably very familiar with them. And I think the question is whether or not to ignore or cast aspersions, as you'd say in Wikipedia parlance, or to actually really think about this, really listen to this, and hopefully to take some action and to use his voice to make real change here. In the meantime, thank you for doing this, Larry. I really appreciate it. Appreciate you taking the time. I know this is a very busy period for you, but it's extremely important what you're doing here. And as I said in the beginning of this conversation, each one of the theses that I read was kind of like, yes, straight to the vein, because you nailed them all. You nailed each one in terms of what you chose to highlight as a thesis, and the way you've laid this out is so relatable to someone, even if they don't really have insider understanding of the platform. So thank you very much for doing it.
I appreciate it. Yep.